there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Athens is Yannis Koutsomitis. He's an award-winning television producer and European affairs analyst. Nicholas Alexiou is a Chancellor's lecturer and the director of the Hellenic-American Oral History Project at Queen's College in New York. Petros Kasfikis is the Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Athens, Macedonia news agency. And Tom Ellis is the editor-in-chief of Kathimerini English Edition, a daily newspaper in Greece and in Cyprus. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And Tom, let me start with you. Your newspaper, Kathimerini, it called this election a, quote, strong mandate for change. So what will Greek voters be expecting from this new administration?
Well, one of the main points was the taxation, high taxes, and the conservative opposition until a few days ago, the new government right now, has promised to lower taxes in a broad spectrum of issues from real estate to companies and otherwise, and everybody is expecting that. Then there's also the issue of healthcare, the issue of education. There will be a lot of changes. It was expected, I think, after 4.5 years of Syriza, but the latter moved from the radical left to slowly more of a center-left position, so it leaves the scene as more of a social democratic party and allows the conservatives to take over and move ahead with their agenda, which was voted by almost 40% of the people, so they seem to have a strong mandate.
Nicholas, as Tom pointed out, this was quite a shift in the voting public in Greece. What do you attribute the failure of Alexis Tsipras and Syriza in this election? Why did they fail so badly?
Well, thank you for the invitation, first of all. Well, I won't consider it a failure. If you see the numbers, in 2015, Syriza got 1.9 million votes and now got 1.8. So after 4 years of being in the government and after this tremendous war against Syriza from left and right and the far right, I don't consider it a failure at all. New democracy can hardly be a modernizing force. If we recall a simple definition of schizophrenia, expecting a different outcome when you do the same thing over and over again. And this is the story. The party which was responsible for bringing Greece to the austerity measures, now they see themselves, or they say that they're going to modernize and bring something new. I doubt it. So it's not a failure at all. It is a different tactic from the Syriza part, I think.
So, Nicholas, what do you make of the New Democracy's proposals to change taxation in Greece, also to get some kind of reform package insofar as their creditors are concerned?
Well, I think they have two models. On one hand is this issue of lower taxation, and on the other hand, it is what we have here in the States, the debate in the States about investment, etc. But again, as I say, the economic policies are directly related to the European Union and the IMF, and you have to negotiate that. It's something that Tsipras did. For the first time in 40 years after the junta, the policies, we have about almost 40 billion of surplus. No other government achieved that. So I don't know what is the model for new democracy, because Mitsotakis was never clear. As you know, he avoided with passion any public debate with Tsipras. So nobody knows exactly. We're just waiting.
Petros, what is your view on how this election turned out? This is a pretty strong mandate, 158 seats out of 300. Is this government going to be able to deliver on its promises?
I think it is indeed a pretty strong mandate, and everything had to do with the economy. I think Nikos described pretty well the paradox of the Greek economy, which is related to the question which came first, the chicken or the egg. In order to get out of this situation, Greece needs strong growth. But in order to get this growth, you need to slash the taxes, the real high level of taxes. So the question is, Will the European creditors agree to such a development? It appears that for the moment, the Europeans will agree only if the growth is already big to support that Greece will meet those fiscal targets. So this is the big debt for the new government. Kyriakos Mitsotakis seems to have genuinely believe that its aggressive plan to reform the economy will produce enough growth to convince the European creditors, but this remains the Gordian knot that the new government will have to find a way to cut.
Okay. All right, let me bring in Yannis Koutsomitis. Yannis, during the campaign, Mitsotakis said he planned to persuade Greece's creditors to accept the easing of tight fiscal targets. And he was going to offer, as I mentioned before, a comprehensive reforms package. Let's listen to what he said.
My goal has been very, very clear: as quickly as possible, return Greece to investment grade status, get rid of any additional sort of monitoring mechanism, and make sure that we borrow at the same cost as other southern European countries.
So, Yannis, how will this be seen by the European Union? What has been their response to this?
Well, so far there is a very hesitant response from the European creditors. At the meeting of the Eurozone ministers 2 days ago, there were strict referrals by the president of the Eurogroup and also the managing director of the Monetary Fund of Europe, the stability mechanism, that Greece needs to stick to its commitments. That means they're not easily willing to budge and give leeway, fiscal leeway to the new government. Also, today there was a meeting between Mrs. Merkel and the Finnish Prime Minister when there was a question from a journalist to Ms. Merkel if there is a space for Greece to change its targets, and she was categorically saying that there is no such thing that can be accepted by the European leaders, despite Mr. Mitsotakis being a conservative as Mrs. Merkel. So I think there will be tough days ahead about how Mr. Mitsotakis will find the necessary leeway with the European creditors in order to implement his tax cuts in the next weeks or so.
So, Yannis, how much concern will there be in Greece over the fact that the EU doesn't want to show any kind of flexibility on this?
Well, we've been used to this kind of negotiations for the last 8 or 10 years. So I think it will be a long process. It won't be solved necessarily in the next weeks. It might take a few months before the final picture of the tax cuts is in place. And even Mr. Mitsotakis said the tax cuts will go into 2020 or 2021. So I expect some talks and some negotiations in the next month. But the main thing is there needs to be some credibility in the new government for the Eurozone institutions that it really wants to implement reforms. I think the key here is not necessarily about the fiscal space, but if the new government is willing to break some eggs and implement the necessary reforms that the previous government was reluctant in implementing.
Tom Ellis, if we look at the broad contours of the new government, if we look at the makeup of the cabinet and the parliamentary support that the new Prime Minister has, Mitsotakis is a liberal who's leading a conservative party. His foreign minister is a liberal moderate. His defense minister is a dove. The 5 women in his cabinet, how much of a balancing act is this going to be for him?
Well, he leads a party that is in a way divided between some people who would be called really conservative or people of the right, and then a lot of people who we would call centrists. So it is a center-right party. He's more of the centrist type. But the extent of the victory, which was probably not expected. I mean, he did a little bit better than people expected. He does have a big majority in parliament, so he can do whatever he wants, I think, if one can say that for a prime minister. So I think he's gonna push hard and quick for reforms. And he has 4 years. There are no European elections, there are no local elections, there are no national elections and other things that we do have in between. So he has a clear mandate. He has given a personal touch in the victory, I think he can push ahead for 4 years and try to deliver.
Nicholas, as Tom points out, Mitsotakis has done a little bit better than he expected, but what are his priorities right now? I mean, he's pledged to cut taxes for households and businesses, including property taxes as well. The country will have to deal with drastic cuts in education, in healthcare, unemployment running at about 18%. This is how the Prime Minister sees his priorities. Let's listen to this.
Jobs, jobs, jobs. Taxes, disposable income, and safety. People are concerned. Safety in the broadest sense. Means people are concerned, especially here, about what's happening in our relationship with Turkey, but they're also concerned about rising crime in their neighborhoods.
So the Prime Minister there talking says his priorities are jobs, safety, combating crime in Greece, as well as taxes. Has he got that right?
Well, look at this. Most of those things have been done by Syriza. But I would like to add something, one more thing, one more dimension regarding to what my friend Tom said about the right-centrist nature of Mitsotakis' government. Because you forgot to mention the far right. And this is the point. This is how Mitsotakis won the elections. It is the votes of the Golden Dawn. On one hand, we have this joyful celebratory event that the neo-Nazis are outside of the of the parliament now. The Golden Dawn. They did not reach the necessary 3% of the vote in order to be included. So they moved. And they found asylum within New Democracy, plus the new neo-Nazi party of Mr. Velopoulos. So this is how he's going to govern. He is trapped in the policies and ideologies of the far right. So it's not just a right-centrist party. New Democracy moves more and more to the far right. So it is impossible for them, ideologically speaking, and politically practicing, to support the middle classes, to support the working classes, to support the whole issue of equality of women and protection of the refugees, by definition.
Tom, do you want to respond to that? Is Mitsotakis going to be caught between the centrists and the far right?
Well, there are these two dimensions in the party, but if you see the people who are making up his government, I don't think, with the exception of one or two people who one could call really conservative, most of them are, mainstream, and a lot of young people from abroad. I understand what Nico's talking about as far as Golden Dawn, but Golden Dawn, thankfully, got less than 3%, but most of that vote went to this other far-right party, which now enters parliament, which I wouldn't call neo-Nazi. I mean, they are nationalists, heavily religious, but not, what Golden Dawn. These guys were killers. So it's, to be fair, I mean, I don't want to be identified with them, but I want to be as fair as possible.
Fair enough.
But the makeup of the government is not, I think it's mostly moderate people who are, mainstream. I mean, you wouldn't call them, far right, I think.
Petros, talking about the country's debt, the Prime Minister wants to implement tax cuts, deep tax cuts. The country still has significant debt. How does one reconcile those two things?
Exactly. The debt is still very high in percentage of GDP. Yeah. In order to repay this debt, Greece has agreed to achieve high primary surpluses till 2022. And this exactly is the point of tension between the new policy mix that Kyriakos Mitsotakis government wants to follow and pursue in order to boost strong growth that pretty much will allow the country to repay its debt, and at the same time keeping the books and meeting the financial targets that has agreed with the financial creditors. So the case here that the new government is trying to make is that by pursuing an aggressive growth policy mix, it will allow pretty much to repay the debt and its way back to growth.
And where will that growth, what will be driving that growth? Will it be consumer spending or?
No, consumer spending was the old policy model, if you want, that get us in this financial mess that we were during the financial crisis. So the new government, the philosophy of the new government is pretty much, it will liberalize the economy. It will boost innovation and entrepreneurship. It will tame the monster, as we call it, of bureaucracy. So through a series of structural reforms that will render the economy more competitive, Greece will become more business friendly, it will attract foreign investment, and this will boost as a return growth.
Okay. Yannis, I want to talk about another challenge that this government will be facing, and it's a challenge that Greece has been facing for some time right now, and that is the refugee crisis. We've had hundreds of thousands of refugees cross the border into Greece, from Syria mainly, from other countries as well. There have been pretty bitter debates in Greece over the influx of refugees, their access to education, their access to health care, the living conditions under which they've been living, etc. Now, some in the New Democracy Party are saying that this needs to stop. Services to the children of refugees needs to stop. How does the new government handle this?
Well, mainly there are the rules that the European Union has about how to stop the flows of refugees from Turkey mainly to Greece. And this is the EU-Turkey agreement that was struck in 2015, naming every refugee or refugee applicant that arrives from Turkey needs to stay on the islands on the Aegean. But the conditions on those camps that the asylum seekers are staying in the islands are dreadful. And this is one of the critiques that many have about the Syriza handling of the crisis in the Aegean Islands. What can be done? I'm afraid not much can be done. The only thing that the new government can is to improve the conditions on the camps and also stop a new flow that has come on the borders between Greece and Turkey on the mainland, on Evros River. That means there won't be much space to do some, let's say, far-right policies. That meaning to copycat the Italian procedure, meaning to make pushovers of boats coming from Turkey to Greece. I'm sure that Mitsotakis will not go into this kind of policies, but the flows will somehow be lower, but still the problem will be there. And the problem stems from not solving the Syria crisis and not having the Syria refugees that are located in Turkey right now relocating back to their homeland in Syria.
Nicholas, we just heard it there. Should Syriza be taking some of the blame for the refugee crisis that the country finds itself in?
Well, I don't know if it is a déjà vu now, what I'm hearing. I mean, New Democracy and PASOK, they're responsible for what we call now Dublin I, Dublin II, and Dublin III treaties, right? That they made this agreement with the European Union to return all immigrants who are captured in other countries back to the country of entrance, which is Greece. And the corruption we had with the MKOs, with the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, right before Syriza. Syriza, for the first time, established some decent hotspots. Not only that, we changed the terminology. That then, who is again in the government, he called them, all of them, illegal immigrants. And Syriza came and he started developing and increasing the rates of asylum, of refugee asylum, recognize citizenship among children who were born in Greece and live there for 20, 30 years.
Tom, I want to talk about another issue facing Greece. That is a foreign policy issue. That is the relationship with its neighbor, Turkey. How do you see relations unfold under the new government?
I don't think there is a lot of change, and there will not be a lot of change. And actually, one of the good things about this election was that foreign policy, and especially the issue of Turkey, which is our main issue, I would call it an existential issue for us, was not part of the debate. During the last couple of years, there was good cooperation between the foreign minister and the shadow foreign minister, who is now responsible for, he did not become foreign minister, he became alternate minister responsible for refugees and migration. So the main policies, and we saw that when the new foreign minister came in like yesterday, and with his counterpart leaving, same thing with the defense minister leaving and the new guy coming in, they all spoke about the same policy, the need to stand the ground. I mean, Turkey is right now pushing the envelope too much. I understand the fact that they are energy hungry. In the East Med, they are faced with alliances or cooperation between countries like Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Egypt. So they are a big country, and one has to respect that. But on the other hand, their behavior doesn't help. So they try to, by violating international law, and it's not only Greece who says that, because a lot of colleagues ask me, I say, well, they say you're Greek, you believe that. When the Israelis say something similar, when the Egyptians say something similar, when the European Union says the same thing, then it's probably Turkey who is violating international law. And what they're trying to do in the Cypriot economic zone, which is the area where gas is being found, or possibly could be found even more, they're trying to be part of the game. But the way to do that is not by sending your own ships, is by trying to communicate your needs and get the others to agree in a peaceful way.
Petros, so the election's over, the government's been installed, cabinet's been announced. What are the signposts that you will be looking for in the weeks and months ahead?
The main signpost is exactly as we said. We had a government which is pretty much a mix between technocrats and politicians. So on the one hand, we have the politicians who, as they say, they understand the will, they interpret the will of the people. And on the other hand, we have a bunch of technocrats who can handle the logistical work of the structural reforms that they are so needed for the economy to move ahead and make the next steps to pursue this aggressive growth that is the #1 priority of Kyriakos Mitsotakis. Because, like he said, his #1 priority is jobs, jobs, jobs. So these all structural reforms, we keep discussing them in Greece. I remember since I was maybe in elementary school, to be honest with you. But the successive governments have failed to produce tangible results. So after 10 years of a deep recession and deep crisis, I think it is the time to see a government finally who will adopt a technocratic approach and pursue the necessary structural reforms for releasing the potential and the dynamism that the Greek economy has.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. But before we go, a reminder to check out our podcast. It's available through Apple, Google, Stitcher, and Spotify. We'll be covering similar stories from around the world that we do right here on the program, but we'll get a bit more personal and candid with our guests and correspondents. So check it out and subscribe. Search online for CGTN and The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.